Good evening. Welcome to the Norman City Hall. Just for my own pleasure, please raise your hand if it's your first time to the Norman City Hall. Lots of young people, welcome. Thank you for showing up and making a difference and learning more about your local government. I promise you it matters. And thank you, parents, for involving them in this process. Tonight we have a study session or a city council conference leading up to our meeting at 6:30, so we have a hard stop time. We have two items on the agenda, so we're going to dive right in. Item number one, we'll have a presentation from Director of Utilities, Ken Comiskey, and it involves a change order to contract 1920-2.
Yes, and to speed things up, I don't have a presentation. This is a $25,000 change order to a $1.44 million contract. We're installing a water line along Timberdale and then south on Jenkins. And we're working cooperatively with the Parks Department. So at this time, right at Reeves Park, there's an old 45-year-old cast iron water line that serves their concession stands. And we're abandoning that, and we're reconnecting a new water line from Constitution up to that area. So it'll get us out of the parking lot area. It'll provide a new water line for the Reeves Park area, and that's what the change order is about.
Okay, and when will this item be on the agenda?
The item is number 32 on your agenda tonight.
Okay, any questions from council members? Councilmember Holman?
Just follow up on that, just making sure that this is kind of sensitive, as in we're trying to do a road widening and improvement project here as well, so getting all this underground work is done beforehand is pretty important, I would.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from council regarding this item? All right, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Comiskey.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and dive into item number 2, a discussion regarding an update on Norman Forward projects. Director of Parks and Recreation, Judd Foster, is going to start us off.
Thank you, Mayor. Happy to be here this evening and been looking forward to this presentation. I'm sure you're all aware that we've got 6 major Norman Forward projects that are underway. Most all of them are in some phase of design at this point. Some are under construction, or small portions of the projects are under construction as well. Each of those major projects has a council-appointed citizen ad hoc group, and those groups meet periodically to review work on the project and provide input to the design team and so forth. Each of those project groups, ad hoc groups, has met in the last month or so to review their current budget and look at the original master plan work and estimated cost, revised cost estimates for the original work that was originally thought to be included in, or desired to be included in, the Norman Forward proposition in 2015. Each of these groups has now voted on a formal motion to seek additional funding, requests that the council work to seek additional funding to fully fund the project as they were contemplated in 2015. We've been working with our project manager, ADG, to put this presentation together. Jason Cotton with ADG is here tonight. He's going to lead you through a summary of each project and talk about the current, the available budget for each project, what the estimated cost to do the entire project would be, and what the shortfall is on each one. Then we're going to follow up next week, March 3rd, with some additional project information that are not Norman Forward projects, and start a discussion about potential funding mechanisms. So that's this is kind of part 1 of a 2-part series, if you will. Yep. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason, and he can take you through the presentation.
And as Mr. Cotton's getting settled, since it is a 2-part conversation, I would ask that council members save all your questions until the end of the presentation so we can get through it for tonight. And for public comment, I don't know if we'll have time for tonight, but there will be for sure public comment next Tuesday, which will be 5:30, also in the chambers. So if we don't get to it tonight, I want to make sure that you're heard. Your presence is certainly felt. But because, again, we have a council meeting at 6:30, I'm not sure if we'll have time to hear everyone, but you will have your opportunity next week as well.
All right. Evening, everyone. The thing that struck me as everyone was gathering is that I missed a great opportunity to hand out ADG baseball caps. And so apologize for that. But as Judd said, my name is Jason Cotton. I'm the Director of Program Management Services for ADG. So ADG has been actually involved in the Norman Ford program since early in 2016. So my predecessor actually retired from ADG. I became the Director of Program Management late in 2018. And so the Norman Ford program turned from something that I observed from afar into something that was very much part of my daily life at work. And so since that time, since late in 2018, I've very much enjoyed getting to work with city staff, with Judd and everyone else. And so I just want to take a second to tell you guys thank you for putting up with me over the last couple of years. I've really enjoyed it. I also want to thank Randy Hill, my senior project manager that's down here on a weekly basis, daily basis it seems like. He and his team have been doing a really good job and kind of getting in the trenches every day and getting everything done. And so thank you, Randy, for all your support down here. So as Judd alluded to, ADG has been working with city staff over the last several weeks and doing kind of a comprehensive funding analysis of several significant municipal projects. And so the presentation that we've brought with us here this evening is basically to report, to update and inform council on the results of that analysis. And put simply, the analysis really is looking at the cost of the projects as they're currently designed and how they were currently envisioned compared to the funding that's available for those projects according to the original Norman Ford program. And so that's in essence what the analysis has accomplished. And so we'll take you through each one of the projects this evening. I don't really like to be overly dramatic. I will tell you that it does feel like we've reached kind of a significant juncture in this process, not only for Norman Ford projects, but also some of the other projects that we'll touch on as a part of this kind of two-part conversation. And really a lot of that, this juncture kind of circles around this conversation of the projects as they were originally envisioned, what the cost of those projects were as they were originally envisioned, and what budget we have available. And so we have to kind of make a decision, I think, at this point. We have to either decide to adjust the scopes of those projects to be something less than what they were originally anticipated to be, or figure out a way to provide them additional funding so we can accomplish the projects as they were originally anticipated. And so we'll walk you guys through all of that analysis. As Judd alluded to, this is a two-part kind of conversation. And so as we started going through this analysis, the conversation was largely centered around the Norman Ford projects. But as we started kind of going through the situation that we have found ourselves in and kind of how to deal with that, it became apparent that there were other projects, other municipal projects that were also in a similar situation. So some of you guys are probably aware of several of these projects: the municipal complex, the transit maintenance facility, emergency operations center. There's a few of them I'm sure that you guys are going to be familiar with. And so we need to kind of organize this conversation in our minds in terms of kind of two buckets of projects, if you will. So kind of a Norman Ford bucket, we'll kind of go through those, and then also a bucket that kind of captures all of these other projects, some of which I just mentioned. So the other thing I think that it's important that we do is spend some time and provide some context for the group. So it's really easy to think about Norman Ford as it is today. I mean, we're sitting here in February of 2020, and obviously we have things that we need to deal with to try to move the program forward, but Norman Ford is something that has been going on for several years now. I mean, the original vision was all the way back in 2014, and so we're 6 years into this program. And so I think it's important to take a few minutes as a group and kind of go back through kind of the significant milestones so that we all have an understanding of kind of how we got where we are today. And so we'll spend some time doing that. When we wrap this up during the second session, we'll spend some time walking council through what we consider to be a discussion of potential options and how we might move forward, and so we'll walk council through those. And then we'll follow that up with just kind of the recommendations as we see them today, things that we've discussed internally with city staff in terms of how we think we could best move forward. So as I said, we're kind of couching this in two different sessions. So session one, this evening's session, will primarily focus on the Norman Ford projects. And so for what we'll do is for each one of these projects, we'll have a conversation of the original vision of each one of the project, and then how that vision has informed the current design as it sits today. Several of these projects, as I'm sure most of you that were involved way back when will remember, that in large part, a lot of these projects that were included in the Norman Forward program had this conversation of economic impact that kind of circled around them. And so as appropriate, we will talk about that. Dan Shim from Visit Norman has been nice enough to provide us some of those economic impact numbers, and so we'll talk about those for some of the projects. We'll talk about the current funding for the project and kind of what we anticipate that funding will support in terms of program. And then we'll kind of just give you a really brief snapshot of the delta between the cost of the original vision and the cost and the current budget as we see it today. So, and so as we wrap up tonight's session, we'll kind of aggregate all of those numbers and kind of give you a snapshot of where we think we are in this kind of first bucket of projects. So session 2, we'll touch on the other projects. We'll go through all the current community needs. We'll talk about the additional funding deficit that those projects represent, and then we'll also kind of button all of that up. We'll talk about potential funding mechanisms that we might use to fund all of these deficits for both kind of buckets of projects. And then we'll talk about some options and recommendations in moving forward. So as I said previously, I do think it's important to maybe take a step back and provide the group a little context on how we got kind of where we are today. And so the Norman Forward program really started kind of in the summer of 2014. And so this predates me a little bit. And so I'm going to tell you a bit of the history as I understand it sitting here today. So the original programs, the idea for Norman Forward started in the summer of 2014. In that summer, a group of community leaders came together with this idea of improving kind of the quality of life for the residents of Norman. And so their idea was to take a series of projects, kind of a slate of projects, large municipal projects, totaling in excess of $200 million, and bring that forward to the voters for consideration. And so that group of projects was largely informed by a study referred to as the Ripken study that was done in 2013 that kind of basically identified for the city of Norman, if they could in fact execute or if they could in fact put in place large-scale municipal sporting facilities of the right scale and the right quality, that there may potentially be some beneficial economic impact from that in terms of drawing people from the region to the city. And so that's kind of the genesis of the Norman Forward program. So sometime in the summer of 2015, that program was brought forward to city leadership. There was a decision made sometime that year in terms of what the appropriate scale of the package would be. And so, and in hopes of making the overall program a bit more palatable for the voters, the scale of the program was reduced from over $200 million to about $150 million. And so that's largely keep punching this microphone, sorry. That's largely the program that the voters received in October. And so obviously you guys know a lot of the history from there. It was very well received by the voters. October 2015, it passes. January 16, so just right after the first of the year, the ad hoc committees began. Judd has already referred to those a little bit this evening. But the ad hoc groups begin to meet, and so the ad hoc groups, I think, are an important point here because they've been with us and the point we're trying to make is that they've been here with us since the very beginning of the program. And they've been helping to they've been giving this tough job of taking what was kind of a conceptual idea in the summer of 2014 and turning it into kind of a concrete thing that someone could go out and design and bid and build. And so it's a really tough job, but they've been with us all the way. So their meeting started in January of 16. February of 16, ADG was retained by the city. And obviously our first order of business was to prepare your implementation plan. So we took the program as we understood it, the budgets as we understood them. We put together a document that was approved by council, and that document basically identified the program for each project, the budget for each project, and then how those projects would be anticipated to be sequenced moving forward. So I do think it's important as we're kind of talking about the context of kind of how we got where we are today to take a minute and celebrate the successes that we've had along the way. You know, obviously we've opened some facilities. May of 2018, Westwood Aquatic opens. July of 18, East Branch Library opens. May of 2019, Westwood Tennis opens. And so we've really put in place some really great facilities that the residents are certainly enjoying as of today. The other thing I want to, reiterate is that we're not just reaching the finish line, but we're doing it in a really fantastic way. The The Westwood Aquatic Facility, for those of you that don't know, was nominated for a ULI Impact Award just recently for Outstanding Public Initiative. And so, again, it just underlines the fact that we're really doing a good job on these projects. In July of 2019, we retained an A&E firm to help us with the design of 3 key facilities for Norman Ford. So the 3 facilities are listed here: Indoor Multisport, Indoor Aquatic Center, and Senior Center. And the reason that this milestone is critical, as you'll see in just a little bit, is this project is probably proven to be one of the most challenging from a funding perspective. And so what we're trying to, I guess, make sure council's aware of is that the group that that the city has retained to help with these projects has been working very hard for almost 9 months. And what they've been really working hard on is either trying to align the program for the facility to the funding that's available, or look at the anticipated vision for the program and the anticipated vision for the facility and see what that program might look like. And so they've been working very hard for almost 9 months on both of those kind of directions. So November 2019, Central Ranch opens. Obviously, that was what a lot of considered to be kind of the crown jewel of Norman Ford. And so that project has also been nominated for several awards. For those of you that don't know, it was also nominated for a ULI Impact Award for Outstanding Public Initiative. It also received nominations from the Association of General Contractors of Oklahoma and the Associated Builders and Contractors of Oklahoma. So again, just a great project. So December of 19, we received kind of our first estimates on the indoor multisport, indoor aquatic, and the senior center. And in essence, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I feel like from our perspective and working with staff, we always kind of felt like we had a way to stitch this thing together. But when these preliminary estimates came in on this project in particular, we felt like we needed to sit down and have a conversation about how we were going to move all of these projects forward. And so January of 2020, we sat down with staff and kind of had a discussion on what these deficits were and how we were going to solve this issue. And so that kind of brings us to where we are today. So as I said earlier, the scope of the conversation tonight is primarily related to the Norman Ford projects. And so you can see here, these are the 7 projects that Jed referred to a little bit earlier. And so we'll spend some time and go through each one of these projects. We'll look at the original vision, kind of how that vision has guided the design to where it is today, what kind of program we think we can support with the current funding, and then what that deficit is. So we'll do that on kind of a project-by-project basis. So the first of these projects, the Indoor Aquatic and Multisport Facility, you can see some specific language there out of the implementation plan on the left side of the slide. But as I said earlier, the 2013 Ripken study is in large part what informed this facility. And so the idea was provide a state-of-the-art facility of a scale that could support not only the residents of the city of Norman, but also attract people from outside of our region into town. And so that was largely the vision that drove the design, or that has driven the design. And so you can see here some of the conceptual renderings that have been prepared by our design team to date. These were prepared by Frankfurt Short Bruja and Barker Rinker CCAD, our design team. And so you can see this is a really nice looking facility. This facility, as many of you probably already know, would be located just immediately north of the Embassy Suites in University North Park. And so there's obviously some synergies that would exist between this facility and that facility within the context of trying to attract people from out of town for tournaments and other regional events. And so this is a little bit plainer view of the pretty pictures that we've already looked at, a floor plan, kind of a programmatic view, if you will. And so the vision or the program that our design team has arrived at, together with the help of the ad hoc committee, is about a 152,000 square feet program. So it would include a 25-yard by 50-meter pool, a 6-lane by 25-yard warm-up pool, and then, as you see here, 8 basketball courts. And so, as I mentioned, Dan's been nice enough to provide some estimates of potential economic impact from a facility like this, if in fact it were in place. And so you can see here, as we've discussed these facilities, they would be co-located. And so potential economic impact could exceed as much as $18 million. And so you see some summary data there for that. I'm sure if Dan were up here, he would qualify you and tell you exactly where he got those numbers, but that's just our estimate at this point. And so, so that's kind of the vision. And so kind of the counter to that is the current funding as we have it today and what that funding would support. And so you can see in kind of the upper right-hand corner of this slide, the $22.5 million that's currently identified in the Norman Forward Implementation Plan. And on the left, you see kind of the program that would support. And so it's about an 87,000 square foot program, 25 meter by 25 yard pool, a 4-lane by 25 yard warm-up pool, and then of course the 4 basketball courts that you see there. So just to, I guess, help you see kind of how these two ends of the spectrum compare to one another. In the gray, you see the program as it's currently designed, as it was originally envisioned, and in red, you can see the program as would be supported by the current funding that's available through the Norman Forward program. So just trying to give everyone a sense of scale between the two kind of extremes that we've shown here. And so just a really quick snapshot to kind of give you a feel for what we currently see as the funding deficit on this project. So $22.5 million that you see on the graph there, that would be the current funding as it exists today. The $58.8 million would be associated with the full-scale program that we walked you through and showed you the renderings of. So obviously just doing the simple math there will give you a funding deficit of about $36.3 million. And so that's that project kind of in a snapshot. So moving on to the next project, Senior Wellness. You can see here again some additional language out of the Norman Forward Implementation Plan there. I just want to remind everybody, you know, a lot of people in the community have been involved in this project from the very beginning, the ad hoc committees. There's been public surveys, there's been a lot of public workshops and other meetings, and so we've taken a lot of community input since this thing started. The ad hoc committee started in January of 2016, as I mentioned below, so they've really been involved in this thing. And so you can see here the program that or the kind of the vision that we have arrived at. Obviously a very nice facility and a very robust program, about a 27,000 square foot program. So you can see some of the items there that are currently in this kind of the program of the original vision. And so similar to the last project, I want to just take you through a little bit what we anticipate that the current funding would allow us to construct. So you can see the budget there, about $7.6 million. And so we think that would support about an 18,500 square foot program, would likely include a walking track and a multi-purpose room. But similar to the multi-purpose or the multi-sport and aquatic facility, you can see there's a significant difference between what was originally envisioned and kind of where we've arrived at in terms of what the funding will support. So again, just a really quick snapshot. You can see $7.6 million, the current funding that we have available to us. The current estimate for the 27,000 square foot program is coming in at about $12.4 million, which is giving us a deficit of about $4.8 million right now. Moving on to softball and football. Again, you can see the language out of the Norman Forward Implementation Plan there on the left. Again, this was largely guided by the 2013 Ripken study and this idea of being a regional draw for tournaments and other events. The interesting thing about the softball and football complex is it's almost kind of a companion project to the Reeves Park improvements, and so they almost work as partner projects. And so this project allows for the expansion of programs at Reeves Park, and so that's why it's important as it relates to the Ripken study. So you can see here the original vision that we've arrived at. It's a group of five adult softball fields, 7 football fields, obviously parking and restroom facilities. It would serve not only the residents of Norman, but also people outside the region. Again, as with multi-sport and aquatic, we've given you kind of an estimate of what we anticipate the economic impact of a facility like this would be. I have put an asterisk on this just to, I guess, reiterate the fact that this is a companion project with Reeves Park. And so that $6.1 million is assuming we would do both projects. So taking a step forward here, looking at what our current funding sits at, $2.5 million. And you can see in the exhibit that we've provided here, we've kind of highlighted the portion of that original vision that we feel like we can execute on given the funding that we currently have available to us. So it would include 1 softball field, a football field, restroom and concession building, and obviously a little bit of parking. So you can see that there. So $2.5 million, the current funding, $11.5 million gets us the original vision as you see it, and so that leaves us a deficit on this project of about $9 million. Okay, so Ruby Grant Park. Again, you see the language from the Norman Forward Implementation Plan on the left. I'm not going to read all of the bullet items there verbatim, but that kind of gives you kind of a bulleted list of kind of what the original vision for the project was anticipated to be. You can see there that program here across the site in this exhibit that was prepared by our design team. And so Ruby Grant is one project that's actually currently in construction, and so we've kind of had to do this one a little bit backwards. We basically had to remove pieces out of the scope of this project in order to get it back in the budget. And so the $6 million is what was identified in the original implementation plan. And so I'm going to take you through a few things that we've removed from that project in the process of value engineering. So the first thing to go was the concrete trails that were around the site, and so we converted those to it's listed as DG here, but decomposed granite, basically like a type of aggregate. And so that was VE'd out. We then went on to pull out some monument signage at the perimeter of the site, and so you can see what those were originally envisioned to be and where they were anticipated to be located. So those came out. The fencing around the parking lots that you see in the master plan, those were also removed to get it back into the $6 million budget. And we've also removed lighting along a lot of site lighting. So lighting not only along the trails, but also at the playground and at the dog park, kind of in the southeast part of the site. We also removed some tree planting, irrigation and sodding, kind of in the southwest area that you see there. And then we've also removed some sodding at these practice fields and at the cross-country track. Now those will still be constructed, they won't be sodded. And so as we sit here today, these are all things that we think really add value to that project. And so as we look at this project and within the context of the conversation that we're having, we feel like, these are things that we would really like to add back in. And so current funding sits at $6 million. We feel like all of the items that were removed from the scope could be potentially added back in for $2.1 million, which would get us to the $8.1 million that you see there. So, Griffin Park, as with the other sports facilities that we've discussed, was largely guided by the 2013 Ripken study, this idea of attracting visitors into the city of Norman. And so you can see here the original master plan that was prepared by our design team. And some of the programmatic elements have also been listed here. So full-size indoor facility, level and grading of all the fields, site lighting, restrooms, concessions, and obviously some other site amenities that you see there in the northeastern part of the site. And so this is obviously a huge soccer facility, would be a huge draw for the city if done right. And so you can see here that the potential estimated economic impact could be pretty significant. $42.9 million annually is kind of what we estimated to this point. So I think it's important to understand, though, where we've arrived at with the funding that's available. So as you can see, we basically have $11 million according to the Norman Forward plan. And so the plan that you see here is essentially what we intend to execute with that $11 million. So all of the fields that you see here would be leveled and refurbished. Field lighting on the majority of the fields, obviously restroom facilities would be added. But there are several things that we did remove, similar to Ruby Park, to get the project back within budget. And so the indoor facility, as it was originally anticipated, was removed from the scope of the project. We also reduced some of the parking improvements that were originally anticipated. So those have been reduced in scope. And the site lighting was from some of the fields was also removed to try to get the project back in budget. And so you can see some of the fields that don't currently have site lighting highlighted there. And so the cost to get, so $11 million, the original funding for the project, we feel like we can get all of these things back into the scope of the project to the tune of about $32.4 million, which gives us a total funding deficit of about $21.4 million. So Reeves Park, as I said, this is kind of a companion project to the football and softball facility that we've already discussed, but also largely informed by the 2013 Ripken study. You can see here, I'm sure many of you have already seen these renderings. These renderings were created by HAF and kind of help the city kind of envision what the original plan was for the facility. So obviously a very nice facility that could host regional tournaments and also serve the residents of Norman. And so you'll see this number, 6.1 million. This is the same number that was reported in the football, baseball economic impact portion of the presentation. And so just to clarify, this is the same $6 million associated with this companion project. So here more of kind of a plan view of the renderings that we just looked at. You can see that this was the original master plan as it was envisioned. The $8 million has basically, this is how far the $8 million that we currently have has basically gotten us. So you can see we have entry road, parking improvements, in large part the things interior to that will not be obviously constructed for the $8 million that we have. Essentially 10 of the fields that you see here would be renovations, and so we would renovate those fields. The one exception to that would be the fourplex of fields that's kind of on the south end of the property. And so that's actually a completely new set of fields and would be constructed within the $8 million budget. And so what we would like to do, if additional funding were something that we could figure out a way to make happen, would be to take those field renovations and basically turn them into new field construction. And so you can see here kind of what this would look like. We basically have a total of 14 brand new fields. The 4 in the kind of the southeast corner of the property would actually be reconstructed, but they would all be new fields essentially when we're done. As I mentioned before, $8 million is our current funding. With the additions that I've mentioned here this evening, gets us up to about $15.3 million. And so that gives us a total funding deficit of about $7.3 million for Reeves Park. So one project that's a little bit complicated to talk about is the park maintenance facility. The park maintenance facility currently sits on Reeves Park, and so within the context of talking about Reeves and the things that we might do there, we have to figure out a way to solve this because, as you can see from this exhibit, the park maintenance facility is in the way of some of the fields that are anticipated to be constructed. And so the way that we've solved this is there was $10 million identified in the original implementation plan for Reeves Park. And so $2 million of that $10 million was set aside to support relocation of the park maintenance facility. And so you can see the budget there as it was kind of currently anticipated or previously anticipated. And so that $2 million would, in essence, take the park maintenance facility as it exists today and move it up to North Base near the city maintenance complex. And so you can see that location identified here on this map. One thing that's complicated this, though, is all of the other conversations that have been going on with the need for transit maintenance facility, also some expanded facilities for the fire department. And so what was at once a relatively straightforward project has turned into a more complicated conversation. And so we do think, we do have a consultant on board. The city of Norman does have a consultant on board to help them through this kind of program. And so we've arrived at about a 16,000 square foot program for the park maintenance facility. It would essentially have about 10 service bays and would include administrative offices for the Parks Department. And so this facility would be co-located with the other facilities which I previously mentioned. So obviously the $2 million is what we currently have available to us. $6.2 million we feel gets us everything that we need as we've described here this evening. And so that leaves us a total funding deficit for the park maintenance facility of about $4.2 million. So just to kind of bring the whole thing around this evening, you can see here we've kind of charted each one of these kind of side by side to kind of give you the whole picture. And so when we take all of the funding deficits for each one of these projects and put them together, we're coming up to about $85.5 million. And that's just for the Norman Ford projects as we've discussed in this evening. And so that's kind of where we're at on this first bucket. As I've already touched on and has been discussed this evening, we will kind of have a second session after this where we'll talk about kind of this other group of projects, what that funding deficit is for those projects, how we might potentially fund that deficit, and then also just kind of some options that we see that the city has in moving forward and what our recommendations might be relative to those options. So I know there's a lot of information. I try to get through it quickly, but that's it for this evening.
I appreciate you getting through that quickly. You left plenty of time, and we've got plenty of questions. I'll start us off with, how did we get $85.5 million off from the target? And this wasn't 20 years ago. This was, 5 years ago. So I think that's on a lot of people's minds, not just up here, but in the community as well.
All right. Well, I think it's important to remember that when when the Norman Forward program was kind of envisioned, we didn't have a lot of information on some of these projects. They were kind of conceptual in nature. We didn't know where the facilities would be located, so we didn't have any idea what site acquisition costs might be. And then also, we've had 4 or 5 years of public input and comment, and the ad hoc committees that have guided the process. And so, obviously, as we set back at the beginning in 2015 or 16, none of that existed, and so it was kind of done in a vacuum in a way. And so I think that in large part is where the $85.5 million has come from.
So essentially, I'm hearing in those 5 years, the costs have gone up, but it better represents the needs and wants of our community.
Yeah, I think as we've discussed it internally, I think that what we've arrived at is, I mean, we can certainly meet the letter of the program. We can deliver the projects as they're identified in the implementation plan. But I think what we've realized is that we're missing the spirit of the program, which is to provide these facilities that would draw people into Norman, state-of-the-art facilities. And I think what we've arrived at with a lot of the ad hoc groups is that they can see that we've arrived at a program where we can meet the letter of what Norman Forward was, but we're not really meeting the spirit, I think.
No, I agree, and I'm all for drawing people into Norman, especially when they spend their money here, but there's a lot of small humans in this room that I'm sure would like the facilities for themselves as well.
Yeah.
Councilmember Holman.
Thank you. Just to kind of hit on that same point, we haven't cut the budget for any of these projects from what voters approved. We're talking about the cost of doing these projects has increased significantly over what voters approved, correct?
Correct.
That's just one, I think, misconception I have heard a lot about in the community is that we've cut budgets, that we're cutting. We're not cutting. We're still planning to spend exactly what voters approved, but we've found out that's not nearly enough, as we've seen here. So I appreciate the information and the detailed information specifically. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Bierman.
So in going back and trying to refresh my memory of the history of this, in the fall of 2018, the Norman Forward Citizens Financial Oversight Board issued a report, and they sounded the alarm about funding shortfalls at that time, but they made no recommendations about reducing or eliminating projects because at that time, the ad hoc committees had either kept the scope of their projects within the budget or had eliminated components themselves during the design phase. So now, 18 months later, has the Norman Forward Citizens Financial Oversight Board received this presentation or anything like it and been given the opportunity to make recommendations that they chose not to do in 2018 because at the time the ad hoc committees had kept the projects within the scope of their budget?
I'm not sure that I can answer that. I may ask on Judd or Anthony.
It might be a question for Judd or Anthony.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm Anthony Francisco, the finance director, and I serve as staff to the Citizens Financial Oversight Board. I'm going to call it the CFOB, if I slip in. The CFOB has a liaison member to each of the ad hoc groups. And at each of the CFOB meetings, those liaisons report back to the Financial Oversight Board on the workings of those ad hoc groups. So yes, at every point when the ad hoc groups have been meeting, talking about potential overruns or where they might cut back on the scope of the projects or change some things to fit within the budgets, the CFOB was informed of that. And certainly their annual reports and reports to council over time has considered that.
But they have not made a report on this particular funding analysis about funding above and beyond what we have budgeted for in order to accomplish the projects.
Only from the standpoint that, and as Jason mentioned, the kind of turning point came when the Indoor Multi-Sport and Indoor Aquatic Center ad hoc group received their updated engineering estimates. And unlike the other ad hoc groups who had received updated engineering estimates and said, okay, how can we make this work? That group basically said, this won't work, and we need more money. And so, yes, that was a change in direction that has been heard by the CFOB.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think in order for me to come to any sort of conclusion about how I feel about it, I'm going to need to hear comprehensively from not just all the ad hoc committees, but the Citizens Financial Oversight Board. I would like to see them look at this information now compared to the information from back in the fall of 2018. In their opinion, what is different and what their course of guidance should be. That's one of the reasons why we have them. And so I appreciate this update, but I'm certainly not going to be able to formulate any kind of thought on a process forward even after the March 3rd meeting until I know what the Citizens Financial Oversight Board has to say as well.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Patron.
Hi, thank you for that presentation.
You bet.
I have a few different questions. I guess, from the beginning, who did create the budgets? Like the outset of coming up with the $200 million?
Well, as I said, some of this predates me, so my understanding is that that was kind of developed by a group of community leaders, and there may have been some involvement from city leadership, but I'm not certain to be 100% honest with you.
Maybe
so.
we can hold that one for Anthony. He'll
Yeah.
probably be able to tell us. And then on the multi-sport and aquatic center, can you give us the breakdown individually? What is the multi-sport side and the aquatic center side?
I can, but I don't have that number here in front of me. I don't know what that is. I'm sorry.
Okay, would you mind sending that to council
Yeah,
when you have an
absolutely.
opportunity? Thank you. Okay, and so I think following up on Kate's question, so to say that we're 85.5 million off of our targets, you said that the original budget was 200 million, and then to make it more palatable, were your words, for the voters, you immediately cut off 50 million, so it went as a $150 million package to the voters. Under that package, were any projects cut out of it?
I don't believe so. I think what happened, again, I'm speaking for people, I mean, I wasn't a part of the process, but my understanding is that the group of projects was the same, but they basically went through and I tried to cut them programmatically.
Yeah.
So there was some anticipation that each one of the projects would give a little in order to get it under the $150 million.
Okay, and then we also added a project, or council did at that time, the senior center, but it had no budget at all.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
So I guess if we could say that cutting 50 from the outset, and then adding 12.4 for the senior center, and then we had a little issue with air conditioning on the tennis facility, so that was another $1 million, but I guess that's not counted for this. So 23.1 million deficit at that point, and I think it would follow up to the mayor's comment. So basically, the expenses growing over 5 years totals about 22 million, not really the 85. It's that it was shorted from the beginning for these projects, and then we didn't have a budget at all for the senior center. So that's what I would see. And then I'd want to talk to Mr. Francisco for a moment. Hi. Could you tell us what the situation is for the projections on Norman Forward for what was passed at the ballot so that people understand why we might have this large of a shortfall? Is Norman Forward performing, or is the revenue that we're generating performing what the expectations were from the outset?
No, we originally projected an annual growth of about 4.25% for the period of the 15 years of Norman Forward. We started with a lower actual original collection, and we have grown at a slower rate since then. So we are projecting right now that we're about 6% below those original projections. And if you just extrapolate that out, we would end with about a deficit from the original projections of about $13 million.
Okay, so if we were to factor in that $13 million from the $22 million deficit that we were speaking of, then maybe we really are getting down to a number that really does sound like how much more expensive it would be in 5 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. See, okay, yeah, so I had asked, wrong person, I should have probably asked you. It sounds to me like the original budgets, this 200 million would have been pretty close, if we didn't have the 5 years. So, I mean, we're talking about something manageable at that point. Who created those budgets from the outset?
I would say a lot of it was informed by the Ripken study. It was informed by the Parks Master Plan that had been completed at the time. It would have been informed by the Library Master Plan that had been completed at that time. But as Jason says, those studies were not informed by updated engineering estimates. They would have been based on square footages and kind of similar facilities in other places and that sort of thing. So as we have gone forward and learned more in today's construction environment, the process of engineering changes over time in addition to the needs and wants of the community, as the mayor has said, changes over time.
Right, but I actually think that it was pretty close. I mean, you're talking
Now, I
about.
will say that there were some projects that were included in the original proposal. There was a football stadium, a high school football stadium in the original proposal that was cut out entirely. There were some changes to the scope of the overall program before it came before the voters.
Right, but that was a lot earlier than what you decided with it. Obviously, you can't put another football stadium in for the 200 million as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so they really weren't that far off. It's just that the voters weren't, what we sent them was insufficient to be able to fund it. So this is not so much a matter of a dereliction of duty on the staff's part for not being able to manage money, as it is that Norman Forward could have never really covered all of these projects to begin with at 50 million short.
I would not say that. I would not be in the position to say that because, again, we were working off of the best information that we had at the time. If someone had said you can't build that football, softball facility for $2.5 million, the answer probably would have been make it work. And what can you do with $2.5 million? And again, projects that have been progressing so far have been shaped by that kind of direction. So I would not say there was any dereliction of duty or anything like that, no.
That's what I was saying, that there was not. Okay. Okay, I think that is the information that I needed from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Bierman.
One of my concerns with all of this is that we're looking at the funding in Norman Forward as simply being insufficient for the construction of these facilities, but these are buildings that need ongoing operations and maintenance and at some point repairs. If we are already so short in the general Norman Forward budget simply for the construction of these facilities, how are we going to keep them operational?
Well, there are several of the facilities, don't forget, that will be operated by other partners. And so it won't be a cost to the city of Norman for these facilities to operate. I mean, the city will essentially be contracting with someone to do that on your behalf. And so I'm not quite sure exactly how much.
I assume they're not going to be maintaining the buildings, though.
I'm sure that will be a lease negotiation at some point. But yeah, so I don't know that it's maybe as large of an impact as you might anticipate initially, but yeah, certainly that's something to think about.
Okay, we don't have any cost estimates associated with that, or
No, ma'am.
so this $85 million is simply for the construction of it, but we're kind of flying in the dark when it comes to what we're going to need either out of the general fund or out of the Norman Forward Fund for ongoing operations and maintenance?
Well, I mean, certainly the numbers that we're presenting here tonight are just the capital to get the facility up and done. You know, I'm sure that as the city moves through negotiations with an operator, I'm sure that all of those costs will be identified. So I'm sure the city would be informed of that well before, so you can make an informed decision, I guess.
I think I would rather be informed of that before we construct all of them, because that seems to be a problem we have, is being reactionary and not thinking comprehensively about all the chess pieces that go on this big old chessboard we're playing with. So that's also something that concerns me, that we don't have any numbers about what it's going to cost to maintain and operate them. If our construction numbers from 2015 were insufficient, it does concern me that operations and maintenance suggested costs might also be insufficient. And so to me, that's a big missing puzzle piece here. Another big missing puzzle piece is we keep talking about this Ripken study, and I don't have it on my iPad. So I have no way to vet that information or look it over to really know the underpinnings of all this economic impact data. That's also something that I'm going to need to have before I can formulate an opinion on this. So those are two things that hopefully we can have before March 3rd, because it's going to be very difficult for me to formulate any kind of opinion on this without all of these things. Sure. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Scott.
Hi, thank you. I have a couple of questions on the I'm looking at the slide here. When it says million economic impact, is that what a projection over how many years, I guess, is what I would like to ask?
It's annual.
It's annual.
It's
Okay, so that's
annual, yeah.
awesome. Okay, so this is it would be an investment. This is what we would get back. So annual
Yeah,
on each
and
one, like Reeves Park, and then
Well,
it should be a moneymaker. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, commentary. We're talking, yeah, money
Well,
making.
Yeah, so it's estimated annual impact, and so,
Okay.
I feel like probably a good idea for me to qualify this a little bit. So that, essentially, in working with Dan over at Visit Norman, they've looked at peer facilities, and so each one of these numbers they kind of qualified with, they looked out in the marketplace at other facilities similar in scale to kind of what's being proposed here, and looked at what the economic impact was from that on an annual basis. And so it's kind of a preliminary look. They haven't really done a deep dive into Norman specifically, but.
No worries. I just want to make sure that I understand everything
Yeah.
we're looking at here. So like the 42.9 million, that would be an annual, basically revenue, is what is anticipated
Direct
from
spending,
just from
correct.
Griffin, this Griffin Sports Complex. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so just making sure I understood that. And then I'm in the deficit. I guess I would like to ask about our budget. I guess I want to ask about, because we've talked before about appropriating from the capital, the CIP for certain projects. Would any of these qualify if we wanted to do that? Would these projects qualify?
We take a shot at that, Councilmember. These would all qualify for capital funding if council chose to do it, but as you could see last week in your presentation on that budget, you have very little
We have very little wiggle
margin,
room.
very little
Okay.
room to work with dollars of this scale.
Okay, just thinking about potential options. The other question I had was about the Norman Regional money. Maybe that's a question for Anthony, our finance director. I'm not sure. I don't know, or our city manager who's not present tonight.
I might be able to answer that a little bit. So the analysis as we've presented it here this evening does not account for any funds from
Okay.
from that transfer.
Okay, that would just be convenient if perhaps we could use some of that money for one of these projects, like the senior center, for example, which I know these are all a priority, of course. There are many people here, many different groups represented. And thank you all for being here tonight and spending your evening with us. So that was one of the questions, and just trying to think about how we go about filling the funding gap. What's up, Jed?
I was going to wait for you to finish. Mayor, if I could address some of the questions from Councilmember Bierman on maintenance and operating. We did set aside $35,000 a year for maintenance of the Westwood Swim Complex. We're collecting that, obviously have been and will continue for the whole 15-year duration. We also, and the purpose of that is to replace a pump or make a certain repair or something along the way if that's necessary, maybe to paint the pool, something like that, which is probably going to be coming up in another year or two. So that's in place for that. We also set aside crews. Actually, the original request for maintenance crews was reduced as part of the overall reduction from the $200 million-ish. It was a little more than 200 million, I believe. But our task was to try to get that down originally to about 100 million and ended up about 150-ish. When we finally said that's as much as we can do. But in that, we have a park maintenance crew now of 3 that is to be triggered to come on board at the completion of Ruby Grant, because that's adding 157 acres of real estate to our inventory. And so the Norman Forward program is paying for that maintenance. We also have some maintenance set up, I believe some custodial type maintenance for the library. I think that's being handled now on a contract basis. So some of these projects have, we can say we've accounted for maintenance and operating issues. I can't say that we've done that for all of them. Jason mentioned that some of the many of the operations actually will be contracted out to other agencies, and maintenance of the facilities, many of the outdoor facilities for sure will be, the maintenance responsibilities will fall with the operator. For the indoor aquatic facility, that's to be determined. And the models that we've seen in other cities vary on whose responsibility that is. And that is, as Jason said, that is going to be part of the negotiation whenever we get to an operator.
Gonna reclaim my time really quick. Sorry, Jed. Because you mentioned the indoor aquatic and multi-sport facility, are those still being planned for the University North Park area where we agreed to in November?
Yes.
We're still planning on construction there?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that looking like it could move and go forward at this time? Lovely. Awesome. And then just need money. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an investment, so thank you. That was all. Just wanted to follow up on that.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Holman.
Anthony, would you mind coming to the podium? So, for those that aren't familiar, I'm the only member of the current council that was actually on council when Norman Forward came through and was part of putting it together. I think I've read the Ripken study, but it was back in 2014, so I too would like to maybe get that and take another refreshing look at it. But if I remember correctly, the original Norman Forward proposal was somewhere around $250 million from the citizen group, and did include a $20 million football stadium, I think it was, that I thought was too large for the two high school teams in Norman to play in. But it was a pretty expansive proposal. The concept was it included trading Reeves Park to OU in exchange for land around the airport. It was a lot different, and over the course of the next year after our first presentation on it, we changed a lot about it. And I think at the very, when the council first started talking about projects, one of the ones we cut out of it was the Expo Center, and I think that was around 15 million, if I can't remember.
Yeah, I forgot about that one, but that's
Yeah,
correct.
we cut that one out before we added the senior center. And I would also note, if I recall correctly, we came up with the number based on how much how much sales tax revenue was projected to be able to raise at 0.5% over a span of 15 years, and that number was 150 million or so.
Give or take, yeah.
So we came up with that number because of how much sales tax we anticipated we could raise over 15 years at 0.5%. And I think, well, I know for sure that when we were discussing those things, I know Mayor Rosenthal felt very, I think, she was very apprehensive, and several of us were, that Norman voters would support such a large package of projects, basically because Norman had never really done anything like this before. Norman's the kind of community, I think, I grew up here, my dad grew up here, my grandfather and my great-grandfather grew up here, And we're the type of community that we really reuse stuff as long as we possibly can. We'll repaint the building and say it can go on for another 10 years, just keep it going. And that's the type of place that I grew up in, and was always the explanation I was given for why other communities had nicer facilities than we had, why other high schools had nicer football stadiums than we did, was because, well, we invest in other things in Norman, and we like to make things last and all that type of stuff. We felt very conservative from my standpoint, and I do have some questions for you coming at you, but we felt very conservative from our standpoint. I personally did not expect Norman Forward to pass by over 70%. I was nervous about it. I thought this might only pass by 51 or 52% if it passes at all. There were a lot of different projects, a lot of different interests. There were people that did not think we needed a new library at all. Why are we going to spend all this money on new libraries? And there were people that thought, I don't play sports, I don't have kids that play sports, why am I going to spend money on all this sports stuff? We were able to get all these groups of people together and say, well, I may not want that facility, but I do want this one. And if those people are willing to help me out with mine, I'm willing to help out with theirs. And I knew then that we were going to have to, it was going to be really tight. I don't think any of us in 2015, we knew we had budget problems in the general fund, but I don't think we anticipated that sales tax revenue was going to decline the way it has over the last 5 years. If I recall, 2018 was maybe the worst year in the last 10 years for sales tax collections. We had
2009, actually.
2009. So in 2018, though, I think we had 11 straight months that were negative sales tax collections compared to the year before. So we've had a really significant downturn in sales tax collections over the last 5 years that I don't think we anticipated at all would happen in 2015. And so I just wanted to get some clarity about how those budgets came up with, how you came up with how much money could we raise in 15 years based off of 0.5%? And would you say that the 4% in 2015 was
It was absolutely realistic in 2015. And again, understand that those same projections that we were making for Norman Forward, we were making for the general fund sales tax growth and the public safety sales tax growth. We have seen, and this was described to council as a mega trend in budget before last. But we have seen a sea change in how consumers behave and the impact that that has on our sales tax. Our sales tax projections were based on 35 years of history. Booms and busts in the oil industry, all of those things taken into account, but no one envisioned that we would have a year where Norman's sales tax would decline.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it might only grow by 3%. Some years it would grow by 6 or 7%, but a decline. Even in the Great Recession, no one envisioned that that sort of thing could happen. But these mega trends are affecting us in a lot of ways that we are adapting to and adjusting to, and the council continues to struggle with. How do we adapt to these things? But yes, it has affected Norman Forward just as it has the public safety sales tax, the general fund sales tax, the capital sales tax, and so forth.
Thank you for that. I would just say if in 2015, if I had known that over 70% of voters would approve Norman Forward, I would have asked for 20 years probably. And I might have asked for a full percent.
And I would have maybe asked for 5/8% instead of 1/2.
Yeah, but again, I think, and I would mention too, Mayor Rosenthal, she originally thought we should only do 3 projects. A Norman Forward Part 1, I think the Central Library, Griffin Park, and Westwood Swim Complex. Do those, show voters that we could do it and do what we promised, and then come back and ask them for another one. But this chamber filled with groups of people, different people from all different groups in town, and asked us all to put it together and let them all decide. And we knew for $150 million we couldn't afford it all, but we also couldn't identify any other projects to cut. Nobody wanted us to cut anything. We cut the Expo Center, we added the Senior Center because people demanded it, and we felt it was the right thing to do at the time. But we knew we were going to have to be tight with our budgets, but again, I thank you for clarifying. We didn't anticipate that we would have such a significant decline in sales tax revenue.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Scott, do you have a quick follow-up?
I do really quickly, yes. Just about is it, because I hate to put another sales tax increase on the ballot up for, when we can't even get it together to get this done. So is it possible to do more of a like business improvement district, but a public improvement district, and try to harness maybe some ad valorem if we did, does it, you know, because like Legacy Park has a business improvement district, and I'm wondering if we could kind of follow that.
Yes, that is one thing that could be done. Under the Local Development Act, the property owners in a given district can petition to the city to tax themselves, if you will, to pay for improvements in their area. But just understand that when we're talking about numbers like this, that would be a pretty big burden for even any, whatever area you're talking about, unless it's the whole city
Right.
petitioning the city. It might be preferable to ask the voters generally, in a general obligation bond sort of proposal. But we'll talk about that next week. But yes, that would be one thing that could be done.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Just asking.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Patron.
My question was for the ADG representative. I'm sorry, I meant to ask before and I let you go away. On the indoor soccer facility at Reeves, it looks to be just one field. Is it a practice facility or like a,
No, it's actually a full-size indoor facility.
so how many soccer fields is that?
Uh,
On the thing, it looks like one as well.
Yeah, it's just one enclosed soccer field. Does that make
So-
sense? It's just one
Yeah.
large field inside.
So it would, I guess, currently, and maybe it's a question for a soccer representative, but currently our kids play on the off-season in various different places, but there'll be multiple matches happening underneath that one roof at the same time, and it doesn't seem like this would be able to do that. So I'm kind of wondering how they envision that
I
working.
mean, there's probably ways they can program the space so that it's a little bit more flexible than just one match at a time. But I think my understanding is that the goal of the piece that was removed was enclosure of a full-size soccer pitch.
Okay, and can you tell me the square footage guesstimate?
No, I don't have
Maybe you
it.
can forward that with the other.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm sure someone over here's taking some notes on everything we need to answer, so we'll make sure we get it answered.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Hall.
Oh, Judd knows the answer.
120 by 60, Steve? The full-size soccer field would be about 120 yards by 60, roughly.
Okay.
That could be used for one game or split up, and this is more their bailiwick than mine, but it could be split up into several games at once with maybe the micro soccer or younger kids playing on a smaller field. And I think they do that routinely now on the large fields that are out there. So I think it just depends on what their needs are at the time, but that would be the size that it would be.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hall.
I actually think this question is for Mr. Foster, so. Thank you. When we are talking about having operators for the various facilities, how many different facilities are you anticipating having a independent operator for?
The Reeves baseball, softball. Griffin, let me just go through the list. The indoor aquatic and multi-sport facility, the senior wellness center, adult softball. Might be easy, well, I'm almost through. Reeves baseball and softball, Griffin Griffin soccer. That's all, everything except Ruby Grant,
Okay.
essentially.
And what would be the scope of the types of things that they would do?
They would organize and provide the programs, the athletic programs or the different programs for the kids that are going to participate, or adults that are going to participate at those complexes. Much the same, exactly the same as Soccer Association does with this at Griffin Park today.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Wilson.
Thank you. Anthony, I tried to get in there before you got down, but I was way down on the list. What, in this, maybe you have these numbers, maybe you don't, what would be the general economic impact to the city of Norman for OU sporting events? I'm just curious.
I have no idea.
I have no idea. Do we have any way of getting those numbers?
Again, we kind of rely on the Visit Norman for those sorts of estimates.
Okay, well, I can email and get that. Thank you. That's all I needed.
Are there any other questions from council or Councilmember Scanlon?
Earlier today, I got an email from the senior union talking about the senior center and possible relocation to the Porter campus. I know that there's a lot of stuff hanging in the air there, but that would, depending on a deal negotiated, if it ever was, would certainly influence the estimates that you've provided. I guess that's just an observation. There's more to come on that, I'm sure. The other question I guess I have, as we were talking some months ago about the multi-sport facility in the aquatic center, there was some discussion of outside donations for one or both of those facilities. Again, I'm sure that that's not included in the cost estimates, but do you have any input, Judd, that
Your comment is correct. The cost estimates that you have tonight would envision the city paying for the entire project. We aren't far enough along yet with potential donor for the multi-sport facility. We hope that will, and we are working to that end to get that to come to fruition. We're not there yet. I think a lot of it depends on how this is going to unfold. But we are working to that end, and in the meantime, we've put the project together as if the city would cover the entire cost.
And I agree with that approach. We have to plan for the worst case, and if we do make a deal with the hospital or we do get donors for these facilities, that's good for us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And further, you mentioned the hospital. There are some components, not the entire facility perhaps, but certain components within some of these facilities that might be, that the project cost, the capital improvement cost might be borne by another entity. Yes, exactly.
Multi-sport center and the Reeves Park location for the senior center. So yeah, more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Hall.
I'd like to follow up on a comment that Councilmember Scanlon just made in regards to the possibility of relocating the senior center from Reeves Park to the Porter campus. Not sure who to address this to, so let me just go ahead and ask the question. My understanding from attending the senior ad hoc meeting last week was as far as the estimates, the project estimates for the senior center, that those wouldn't change substantially between locations. Do you want to address that? Is that accurate, or is that something we need to correct?
No, I think for the purposes of, where we're at in this process, I think the budget as we've identified it, certainly there'd be some component of that budget that would be associated with site improvements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't see those changing significantly from one site to the other.
Okay.
I wouldn't anticipate that they would.
Okay, I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you, Councilmember. I don't see any other questions at this time. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up for now because we need time to transition to our next meeting. But again, next Tuesday, March 3rd, 5:30 p.m. right here in this room, that'll be our only meeting, and I look forward to hearing from each of you as we continue to consider this proposal. I can't thank you enough for coming out tonight. We know that people care, but it is impactful to see all of you, especially y'all in uniform. You should get a picture of everyone here in City Hall. This is really special, and this is what makes our city great. So thank you for coming out tonight. We're going to conclude this council conference, and we'll see you next week.